All right. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Such a pleasure to start this class again. So I think we'll get straight to it. We actually had just finished chapter 5, and I think we're up to chapter 6. Chapter 5 was Torah. Before that was holiness. Before that was the soul. So now we're up to chapter 6. But as we've done now for a few months, or maybe even more than that, I want to begin with a special psalm. Since we are learning Rabbi Steinsaltz's book, and as you know, Rabbi Steinsaltz had a stroke some 2 years ago, and Baruch Hashem, he's fine, he's still very communicative, and he's very, very present, and he still goes to work every day. I had the privilege of being with him 4 weeks ago when I was in Israel, and he's still very, very much Rabbi Steinsaltz, but his speech almost barely exists. So, because of the stroke, so I'd like to, together with you, recite the Psalm 45, which is a psalm of speech, so that we can pray for him, for the author of the book that we're learning, Rabbi Steinsaltz, Adin ben Rivka Leah, and for his full and speedy recovery, and particularly for the power of his speech to return completely as before. So this is Psalm 45. Okay, this chapter now goes into a whole different world. It's called the way of choice, an answer to ethics. Just a small word of introduction, because the words of Rabbi Steinsaltz speak for themselves. Even though the word that is used here as the title is the way of choice, and I've heard this from Rabbi Steinsaltz himself, this is just so that people can understand what this is about. But really, the word for choice in English is a very interesting word, because if we are really speaking about choice, then there are very, very few choices that we make in life, as opposed to what this chapter speaks about. Because choice means that I am really choosing between one thing and the other. But most of our choices in life are not choices. They are preferences. We might think that we are choosing, but we're really preferring one thing over the other. If someone tells me, hey, do you want apple juice or orange juice? I might think that's a choice, but it's not a choice. It's a preference. Because something, maybe my genetic disposition, my education, my environmental influences are leading me to choose apple juice over orange juice. So it's really a preference. It's not a real choice. Choice only exists among two identical things. But just to clarify that, because the way of choice is really, this book was translated from the Hebrew. But we are speaking here about preferences more than choices. And at the end, he'll talk about this idea of choice. All right, let's begin. Just as there is content. Does anyone want to read? Right. So one of the great statements of the Talmud is that yesh manhig labira zu. The Talmud says that in many, many different instances, but it means that there is a leader to this capital, to this world. We don't live in a jungle, as many may think, but we live in a place that is really the palace of God. And just like in every place, and particularly in palaces, there are rules on how to behave in a palace, what to think about in a palace, what to do in a palace. There are rules. And this is the first big idea. Before we speak about choices, we have to know that there are things, like Rabbi Steinsaltz says himself here, there are proper ways for which for a person to do things in this palace of God. Yesh manhig labirazu. And in a way, I think that's why the Code of Jewish Law, which is, we mentioned in the previous class, the Code of Jewish Law is really the gathering of all of the laws of Judaism, all the practical laws. It's a very legal book. It's not a philosophical book in any shape or form. Tells you how to do things, right? How to respect your parents, how to fix a mezuzah, how to wake up in the morning. Tells you how to do things. But what's interesting is that the introductory chapter is not a legal chapter in the Code of Jewish Law. The introductory chapter speaks about waking up in the morning and how a person should realize that there is God standing over him, V'hinei Hashem nitzav alav, standing over him, and he investigates his every move, his kidneys, bochen klayot valev. He investigates his kidneys, his heart, im avdo karaui, to see if the person is going to worship him karaui, fittingly or not. By starting the day, I think, with that idea that there's a God. We're accountable here. It's not a jungle. We have to do the proper things. Then I think it betters betters our way of life and betters our life altogether. I don't know if I've mentioned this in the past, but there's a book I have here in my office. It's called Big Gods. It's a book by, I keep forgetting his name, it's a long Iranian name, but Nazardian or something like that. But he's a professor who proves scientifically that people who believe in God, who again wake up in the morning knowing that there's a God watching over them, are nicer people. Now you can agree or disagree, but he says, therefore, religions, regardless of the religion you belong to, religions are good for the world and not bad for the world, as many may think. And he proves that scientifically. One of the proofs comes from a scientific, I don't know, stop me if I've mentioned this, but from a scientific study that was done at Columbia University. Apparently there's a free coffee station, but there's a little basket on the table of next to the coffee where you can leave a donation. If you feel like you like your coffee or that you want to help support this so that it continues on, then you can leave a few coins or a few bills. So he experimented something quite interesting. He said, I want to see if I put a pair of eyes, a big pair of eyes behind the coffee station, I want to see if people will feel that, maybe even subconsciously, and feel that someone is watching, and maybe they'll be nicer, maybe they'll give more donations. And lo and behold, people gave more donations when that pair of eyes was there than when it wasn't there. And here again, he proves, you see, watched people are nicer people. That's his conclusion. And he experiments that in so many different ways. But again, when we feel that there's a God watching us, then we behave in certain ways. We know that there's rules, that there's a proper ways to do things in this world. And I think, again, that's why it's the introduction to the Code of Jewish Law. It's almost as if the Code of Jewish Law is telling us, hey, before you behave a certain way, before you learn how to do things, there's one fundamental notion that stands at the foundation of it all. And that's the knowledge that God is watching you all the time. I tell my students at Pardes often that how many times do you think you are filmed each day? Do you know how many times, statistics again, how many times the average American is filmed each day? When you go to the gas station, you filmed. When you came here, you were filmed, by the way. Just for you to know, to be honest. Wherever you go, you film these days. So how many times do you think you filmed every day? It's astonishing. The number is astonishing, but it's about 170 times. So they all say, oh, wow, my privacy is gone. Well, but there's a camera on you 24/7. You filmed all the time. Who? Really? 24/7? Yes, God. God is watching you all the time. And I think that knowledge in and of itself, again, already enables us to live a more accountable and certainly a more meaningful life. So that's the short introduction here of Rabbi Steinsaltz. Big idea. By the way, I want to emphasize also just one thing that comes to mind, and that is that it's not, we have to have in mind that God is watching us like, there's a camera, we have to be afraid. The opposite. Just like the prayer of the Modani reflect, we have to know that God is watching us, but with love, with faith. The prayer of Modani says so at the very end. We say, Modani lefanecha, we thank you Hashem for restoring the soul within me. And then we say, Bechemla Rabba, with great kindness. And then, Rabba emunatecha, great is your faith. Great is your faith in who? What does that mean? Rabba emunatecha is us proclaiming that we know that God's faith in us is great. Even if our faith in ourselves is no longer, God still believes in us. So when we speak about this watchful eye, this pair of eyes above the coffee station, it's not eyes that come to get you. The opposite, it's eyes that believe in you, that have faith in you. That in of itself should give us the greatest confidence in our purpose, in our way of life, in our way of doing the proper things, the proper things in life, like Rabbi Steinsaltz here writes. Okay, so that's, welcome Seth. How are you? Okay, so that's the introduction. We can continue unless there's any other questions, comments. In Judaism, does anyone want to continue to read? Anyone? In Judaism, this way is not simple anyway. Okay. Right. Okay, let's stop here for a second because this is really a very powerful point and written beautifully and I think very purposefully also. But I think that explains a question that I had about this book many years ago, but why this order? It seems like every chapter can be a book in and of itself. Right? If you've been here for the past year or 2 or 3, when did we start this? 2.5 years ago. So yes, amazing. So you know that every chapter can be a book in and of itself. So then why did Rabbi Steinsaltz choose this order. And I think that what we just read now, answers this question. First, we have to know ourselves. First, we have to know the soul and holiness, the holiness of the soul too, and the duty of the soul to connect to Torah, as we spoke about. And then we can know our purpose in life. Then we can know how to take that soul and actualize it in its own unique way. Because as he says here, everyone is different. And to try and live someone else's life is certainly not what God wants us to do. So everyone is, even two, like we mentioned before, even two identical twins are not the same. Everyone is different. Everyone has their own purpose. It reminds me of the story of Rabbi Zusha, the famous story of Rabbi Zusha, who was crying one day, and I asked him, why are you crying? And he said, because when I will die, God will ask me in the heavens, why? He won't ask me, why wasn't I like Abraham? Why wasn't I like Isaac? Why wasn't I like... He'll ask me, why wasn't Zusha like Zusha? And to that, I'll have no answer. Zusha has to be Zusha. Me, I have to be me. You have to be you. Everyone has to be themselves. Therefore, we first have to have the soul chapter, and then this. But that's really the point. And therefore, because we have to be ourselves, the choices that we face in life have different answers, have different pathways. So I could be right now faced, let's take a holy choice, just for the sake of the exercise. I could be faced right now with the choice of praying, maybe it's the morning prayer right now, and helping someone. I had this choice this morning. I had to go to school, Pardes, they need help, or should I go and pray? Now, there's no right or wrong answer to that question. You'll be doing a good thing either way. But it really depends on the complexity of your being and on the purpose of your being. Are you a person that can really be helpful? Can that be effective or not? Maybe for you it's better to pray. It's almost like an army, right? If the paratrooper tries to be the chef of the army and the chef tries to be the paratrooper, the army will collapse. Everyone has to know their own way. So therefore, the choices that we face have no right or wrong answer, are unique to our personalities, to our own complexities. That's the main point that Rabbi Steinsaltz is making. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments on this. We can continue on and on. That's why, we've mentioned this before, but the word for, there are two beautiful words in Hebrew. The word for a face in Hebrew is in the plural tense, panim. Why? Because we have many different faces. The face we have with our spouse is not the same face we have with our students. The face of our students is not the same face we have with our colleagues and so on. We have many faces. That's reflective of the complexities within us. It's number one. Reminds me of the story of this guy who he went to Paris. And he came back home, and his wife asked him, so how was Paris? He said, you won't believe it. I met a believer in Paris, and I met an atheist in Paris, and I met a tourist in Paris, and I met a local guy in Paris, and I met this type, a nationalist, a socialist, a communist, a whatever. Met all these different titles. So his wife says, what's the big deal? Paris is a big city. You have different types of people. He says to her, yes, you're right. But all of those different titles belong to one man. It was one man. It was both the communist and socialist. One man that was both the local guy and the tourist. It was all one man. But in a way, it's reflective of that panim, of the different sides that we have. And we each have different sides. The more we know ourselves, the more that we know that soul that we spoke about, right, or the expressions of the soul, the more we can know what our purpose is. That's one word. Another word in Hebrew is the word nefesh, which really relates to the word being. Now, there's a nefesh is, just to point out, nefesh is very often mistranslated as soul. The word for soul is neshama. It's not nefesh. Nefesh is the word for being. I think that's maybe a more accurate translation. But what's interesting is that the Kabbalists teach, it's a book of Kabbalah. After all, the Kabbalists teach that nefesh is really a combination of two Hebrew words. If you take the word nefesh, you can split it. So you have, if you mix the letters around, so it's nun, fe, shin. If you take the first letter and the last letter, you have the letters nun and shin, and then you have shen. Okay, and the middle letter, is the letter pe. And it says that nefesh Every nefesh is different. Every being is different, just like every peh and shen is different. What's a shen in Hebrew? Shen is a tooth. No tooth are identical. Even the DNA of people can be, isn't it right? Is reflected in their teeth. Every tooth in the world is different. And so is every mouth, therefore, in the world different. So when we look at a nefesh, we have to recognize that every nefesh too is different, just like every tooth and mouth is different. So that's another interesting take on the complexities of the human being, the uniqueness of every human being. Okay. Now the goal, and that's, I think, the key word in this paragraph, the goal of every human being is not just to recognize how unique they are and how many facets they have, but also, and that's the key word, is to try and create some type of fluidity between all of those facets. That yes, we might think that having both a communist and a socialist within the same being, to use that joke, is a contradiction. But somehow we have to find a fluidity, a connection between the two sides. That's the goal of every human being. I would say that's the greatest challenge of every human being, to try and connect all of the sides, that many different sides that we have, into one piece. But on the other hand, I think it's what creates beauty in every human being. It's not the Botox and the makeup and so on, but it's really our ability to sew all of those different colors together. There's a great story, but I don't know if you've heard of a city called Kashan. Kashan is a city in Iran. And it used to be a very Jewish city. And some 150 years ago, I heard the story from someone from Kashan, who's a professor in Tel Aviv. And he tells the story about how about 150 years ago, they didn't like the presence of Jews in Kashan, the locals. So they decided to speak negatively about them and eventually convinced the governor of Kashan to get rid of the Jews. And eventually gave 30 days to the Jews to get out of Kashan. And they didn't know what to do. The Jewish rabbis assembled all the Jews in the synagogue to try to figure out how to get out of this decree. And the woman came up, the woman of Kashan, and said, we have a solution, put it in our hands. We know how to convince the governor. They trusted them, and after 30 days, everyone was asking the woman, we're about to be kicked out. What's the story? They said, we're going today to the governor. They went that day to the governor with two different carpets, right? Iranians, Persians are known through their carpet, with two different carpets. And they presented to the governor two gifts. They said, we have two wonderful carpets for you here. They opened them up, and the governor sees one carpet is entirely red. Another carpet is beautifully sewn together with so many different patterns and colors and so on. And then they tell the governor, which carpet do you like? They both belong to you, but which carpet do you like more? He said, obviously this one with all the patterns, it's just magnificent in its complexity and beauty. He says, so then they answer to him, well, you see, Kashan up until now was so magnificent and beautiful, all the different cultures that lived here. You want to kick us out tomorrow? You'll have a red carpet. That's what you'll get from this. Don't you prefer this other carpet? And they won the argument, and the Jews were allowed to stay in Kashan. It's a true story, apparently. But again, no human being is made of just one big red carpet. It doesn't exist. I don't know if you've met a human being like that. I have, but they're all in the cemetery. And no living human being is made of one big red carpet. I think if you're alive, then you have many different sides. You, as that human being, have to find a way to sew all of these colors together. But we should take that also into consideration when we interact with others. Last week in the Torah portion, we read of a list of kosher animals, kosher birds, kosher fish, right? So for kosher animals, it's easy because they have signs. They need to chew their cuds and split hooves. And fish is the same, right? They need to have fins and scales. Even though you should know, the Talmud states that if they have scales, they have fins. If you see a fish with scales, it means that it has fins. How the Talmud 2,000 years ago knew that, after we've discovered thousands of new fish species and still that logic remains, that's a wonder. But in any case, that's about fish and animals. Birds, how do we know which birds are kosher? They don't have signs. There's a list. Pigeons are kosher, for example. Why? Because it's in that list. And then there's a list of non-kosher birds. Now there's a bird called the chassidah, which is translated as What? Stork. He said, yeah, that's the Hasidah. Now, why is it called Hasidah? You would think it's a kosher bird because of the name. Name Hasidah. Why is it called Hasidah? Because it's called Hasidah. The root word is chesed, which means kindness. Because it's a bird of kindness. It's kind to its cheeks, to its own species. So Rashi asks a question. So then why wouldn't it be kosher? Why is it in the list of non-kosher? It's a great attribute. And Rashi responds, that's because it's only kind to its own. It's not kind to other birds. And that's not the kindness we appreciate, we want. And in a way, I think that's reflective of this idea that we have contradictions. And there's many different types of people. And often we say, oh, I don't like you. You're not my type, so I'll be only kind to my own. Rabbi Steinsaltz very often says, Rabbi Steinsaltz was, by the way, in the directorship of the Jerusalem Zoo for many years. He has so many beautiful analogies about animals. One of the things he said to the New York Times, I remember a few years ago, he was interviewed and he said that wives that have PhDs and so on, or even rabbis who have so many accolades and so on, that doesn't impress him. They asked him why. He said that that's because he was privileged as a director in the Jerusalem Zoo one day to go and see a peacock that was completely shaved. And he saw the peacock that was completely shaved, and he said it was the ugliest creature he's ever seen. And since then he realized, I know some people like that. They have a lot of beautiful feathers, great accolades. But when you shave all these titles, you see, oh, it's an ugly chicken. So that's one of the lessons you learn from animals. But another lesson you learn from animals in that regard was that, one of the main differences between animals and human beings is that animals can only live with their own, right? Giraffes live with giraffes, zebras live with zebras, and lions live with lions. They can't live with another species. What makes us human beings is our ability and our duty to live with those who are not like us. If you don't live with those who are not like you, then maybe you're an animal. That's Rabbi Steinsaltz's words. But this is what this says. Recognize that everyone is unique. And everyone has their own differences, their own contradictions. But does that mean I'm going to dismiss a person because I don't like the color he's wearing? Because I don't like the opinion he's voicing? Does that mean I cannot connect with something else that might be in common with me? That's the exercise we have to do as human beings. Okay, so we're continuing. We're speaking about the complexity of every human being and how everyone is different. But let's jump here to the bottom of page 75. Does anyone want to continue? Maybe a few more lines. Only he can do it. Right. I just want to point out something, because if you think about this, it could sound like a contradiction. So what is being said now is what we've said now the past 45 minutes, but basically that everyone is unique. Everyone has his different calling. Everyone has a different purpose in this world. We have, some are more emotional, some more intellectual, some belong to this letter of the Torah, some others to another letter of the Torah. By the way, if you've noticed, that's why we have that piece of art at the entrance of CBT, because really everyone carries their own letter. That's right. Did you see that? Human beings carrying letters from their own Torah. Everyone has their own letter. Everyone has their own unique calling based on their complexities. Now, that's on the one hand. Think about it this way. On the other hand, we each have our own complexities, but we also have the same obligations. The way he started this chapter is that there are proper ways to live in this world. There's a Torah for all. There's the same mitzvot for all. So that might seem like a contradiction. Is there a universal way to live, or is there an individual way to live? And the answer, I think, is in the harmony between the two. Yes, there is a universal way, the way he started speaking about the proper ways to live. But within each and every law that is universal, there is a particular way to perform it. I would say it's like playing music, right? If you are told to play the violin, you play the violin. But there's only one. There's a way that only you can play the violin, and no one else can play the violin. So the violin is the violin. The law is the law. But there is a way that only you can perform that law, and that is where we have to really find ourselves. Not so much in following the laws or not, but more in the ways we exercise those laws. Again, I think that's what makes this world so beautiful. I want to just clarify one thing also from this paragraph, and that is that we spoke of the divine Shekhinah, the 70 faces of the divine Shekhinah. So maybe going back a few chapters, going back to the chapter of the soul, so Rabbi Steinsaltz speaks of this idea of root souls, that there are 600,000 root souls. In other words, 600,000 roots. And in a way, our purpose in this world has already been defined by the root we come from. And therefore, as Rabbi Steinsaltz said in that chapter, the chapter soul, the more in tune we are with our soul, with who we are, with our individual purpose, the more we can live that purpose, the more we can really live a life that God intended us to live. So I think this is very much dependent on how much we know ourselves, how much we know what our strengths and weaknesses are, how much we know what our talents and skills are, how much we know what opportunities we have each and every day. The more we know that, the more we are aware of that, the more we can live that unique purpose that we have to live, or the purpose that was already defined by the root from which we come from. I'll just conclude by saying, we said this in the previous class, we said this also in the Tanya class on Sunday, but I was really touched. Dr. Ron Melmed, who belongs to this congregation, he's the head of the Melmed Center here, he was here on Shavuot, and he quoted Jeremiah that says that before God created us in the womb of our mothers, He knew us. What does that mean? It means that God already decided who we are, even before He created us. If parents, Dr. Melman was saying, if parents can only know that, and he said in a beautiful way, if parents can only know that children don't come from us, we don't create their personalities, we don't create their skills, their talents. They're already created before that. Children don't come from us, but rather they come through us. Then they'll also understand that their role as parents, or we can say that towards ourselves, the role that we have towards ourselves, is really to be able to navigate that which we have already, right? The personality that we have already in the best of ways. We can't try and change that which we already have. That's impossible. That would be changing divinely created creation. But we can try and understand what we have to do as parents, and also as human beings, try and understand what type of soul we have, what type of calling we were given, and based on that, navigate in the best of ways. Children don't come from us, they come through us. We don't come from us, we come from through us. We come from what God has created many, many years before our mother created us in our womb. That's the big idea. I want to add just one thing that from Ephraim, you reminded me. Rabbi Steinsaltz will often tell us, I don't care what you become, but there are two conditions that I need from you. You have to be who you were born to be, and you have to be the best at it. It says, if it means that you have to become a criminal, then be the best criminal in the world. Be the best doctor in the world, but whatever it is, be what you were born to be. And criminals, no one is born to be a criminal, but Rabbi Steinsaltz's way, and you have to be the best at it. And I think being the best at it gives you that resilience along that very long journey. So the Kabbalistic notion, beautifully said, we've spoken about this, is that there are two worlds, many more worlds, but two worlds in this context. It's the world of thought, Olam HaMachshava, and there's the world of speech, Olam HaDibur. That's why, by the way, that's another lesson in of itself. But even if you think something negative, you shouldn't say it. Because by saying it, you're drawing it down from that esoteric world and giving it an existence in this world. Even if you think something, don't say it. Lubavitcher Rebbe, by the way, was very, very careful about his speech. He never said anything negative, even when he had to. If he had to speak about death, he would say, Hepech HaChaim, the opposite of life. Because he didn't want to mention that word, because it's, again, giving it its own existence. But it's true in the negative sense, it's true in the positive sense. When we speak Rabbi Steinsaltz's words, we are giving them a life in this world. And that life in of itself, in a way, triggers his power of speech once again. So it's there, right? But we have to draw it down. How do we draw it down? Through speaking his word. Almost like a car. or the power of the car is there, but you have to actually ignite it. You have to. So that's the ignition. By speaking His words, we're igniting His engine, so to speak. Thank you, Shakar. All right. Thank you.